Denzel Washington was sitting in a McDonald's in Atlanta, enjoying a moment of calm when a 5-year-old boy clutching a worn teddy bear approached and whispered something in his ear. Immediately, Denzel turned pale and dialed 911. What happens next? We'll move everyone. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. It was a Wednesday afternoon in Atlanta. The sky was painted a flawless shade of blue, with only a few wisps of clouds lazily drifting by, while the sun's warmth reflected off the gleaming skyscrapers downtown. Denzel Washington, known for his commanding presence and unmatched charisma, was driving his car toward his hotel after a long day on set. He had just spent 12 grueling hours shooting an intense scene for his latest film, a role that demanded both physical stamina and emotional depth. After the exhausting day, feeling tired but wearing a satisfied smile, Denzel decided to do something unusual. Instead of heading straight to his hotel or choosing a sophisticated restaurant recommended by the production team, he pulled into a McDonald's by a busy intersection near Peachtree Street. Why not, he thought. He missed simple moments like this where he could relax away from the constant spotlight of cameras and expectations. Sometimes, even Hollywood legends craved normalcy. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was welcoming, despite the usual hustle and bustle. Families were scattered across the tables, children laughed while chasing each other between chairs, and the sound of orders being called out echoed in the air. The familiar aroma of fries and burgers filled the space, evoking a nostalgic feeling that reminded Denzel of simpler times, before fame had changed everything. Denzel entered discreetly wearing a simple navy cap and sunglasses, a combination that emphasized his casual and laid-back demeanor, while offering a thin veil of anonymity. He ordered a simple meal at the counter, a quarter-pounder with cheese, fries, and a Diet Coke, and found a seat in a quiet corner of the restaurant. With his phone turned to silent, he allowed himself to observe his surroundings. For him, this was a rare moment of disconnection from his hectic life in the spotlight. While he ate, something caught his attention. A child sitting at a nearby table couldn't stop looking at him. It was a boy with curly black hair wearing a bright red t-shirt with a superhero logo. In his arms, he clutched a well-loved teddy bear, holding it close as if it were his most prized possession. The boy seemed hesitant, his eyes shining with a mix of curiosity and something else, something that looked strangely like urgency. Denzel smiled subtly at the child, finding his attention endearing, but soon returned to his meal. However, he noticed that the boy continued to watch him, as if gathering the courage to do something. At the same table, sitting beside the boy, was an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes that occasionally darted to her watch with concern. She appeared to be his grandmother, judging by the gentle way she wiped ketchup from the corner of his mouth, while simultaneously checking her phone with growing anxiety. The contrast between the boy's intense focus on Denzel and the grandmother's distracted worry created an odd tension that the actor couldn't help but notice. With each passing minute, the boy's restlessness grew until he finally did the unexpected. With timid steps, the boy climbed down from his chair, clutching the teddy bear to his chest. His eyes didn't leave Denzel as he slowly walked in his direction. The restaurant seemed to grow quieter to Denzel's ears, as if the world around them had slowed down, though in reality, the busy dinner rush continued unabated around them. Denzel noticed the boy's approach and set his burger down on the tray, turning fully toward him. The boy's grandmother was distracted by an incoming call, her back now turned as she spoke urgently into her phone. When the boy stopped beside his chair, his eyes were filled with something Denzel couldn't immediately identify, a mix of fear, determination, and hope. The boy leaned in, his small body trembling slightly. He opened his mouth and began to speak, but his voice was so low that Denzel had to lean closer to hear. "My mommy is locked in a dark room," the boy whispered, his voice quivering. "The man with the scar on his face said nobody will ever find her, but I know where she is." The child's words were shockingly clear and specific, carrying the unmistakable weight of truth. The words hit Denzel like a physical blow. He'd played enough law enforcement roles to recognize the urgency in the child's voice. This wasn't imagination or play acting. The detail about the scar, the specificity of his mother. Being locked away, it carried the hallmarks of a genuine cry for help. "What's your name, buddy?" Denzel asked softly, trying to keep his expression calm despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "Elijah," the boy replied, clutching his teddy bear tighter. "My mommy's name is Vanessa. The bad man took her from our house this morning. Grandma doesn't believe me. She thinks Mommy just went to work." Denzel maintained his calm demeanor, but something in his expression shifted. His eyes, usually warm and engaging, hardened with resolve. He knew that this seemingly random encounter would ultimately change his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. "Elijah, how did you know who I am?" Denzel asked gently, buying time as he processed what to do next. The boy's answer was disarmingly simple. "You help people in the movies. You always save them. I saw you on TV with Grandma. I knew you would help my mommy." Denzel felt a lump form in his throat. The faith this child had placed in him, not just in his celebrity, but in the heroic characters he portrayed, was both touching and terrifying. This wasn't a script. There would be no director calling cut if things went wrong. "Where is this man keeping your mother, Elijah?" Denzel asked, his voice dropping lower as he subtly reached for his phone. "In the big building with the red doors, by the water. I saw it when he made me hide in the car." Elijah's voice trembled. "He said if I told anyone, my mommy would disappear forever." Denzel's blood ran cold. The description matched a warehouse district near the river, not far from the film set where he'd been working. His mind raced through possibilities, weighing the child's account against the likelihood of misunderstanding or imagination. But the fear in Elijah's eyes was real. The details were too specific. And something in Denzel's gut, the same instinct that had guided him through decades in an unpredictable industry, told him this child was telling the truth. With deliberate movements, Denzel picked up his phone and dialed 911. His hand was steady, but his face had drained of color as the gravity of what Elijah had shared sank in. As the phone rang, he gently placed his other hand on Elijah's shoulder, a silent promise that the boy had done the right thing by coming to him. What's your emergency?" came the dispatcher's voice. Denzel's response was clear and controlled, despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. "This is Denzel Washington. I'm at the McDonald's on Peachtree Street. I need police assistance immediately. A child has just approached me with information about a kidnapping." Across the restaurant, Elijah's grandmother had finished her call and was now looking around frantically, her eyes widening as she spotted her grandson standing next to one of the most recognizable actors in the world. She rose quickly, confusion and concern etched on her face as she started making her way toward them. Denzel knew the next few minutes would be crucial. A woman's life might hang in the balance, and a child's trust had been placed squarely in his hands. The restaurant continued its busy evening service around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their quiet corner. As the dispatcher asked for more details, Denzel locked eyes with the approaching grandmother. The real-life thriller he had unwittingly stepped into was just beginning, and unlike the movies he starred in, no one had written the ending to this story yet. 911, I need you to stay on the line, Mr. Washington. Officers are being dispatched to your location now. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Denzel kept his eyes fixed on the approaching grandmother while maintaining a protective stance near Elijah. The woman's face cycled through expressions of confusion, recognition, and then alarm as she hurried toward them. "Elijah, what are you doing?" she called out, her voice strained with worry. "I'm so sorry," she said to Denzel. "He shouldn't be bothering you." Before Denzel could respond, memories from his role in Man on Fire flashed through his mind. The fierce protectiveness he had channeled while playing a bodyguard willing to do anything to save a little girl. The parallels were uncanny, but this was no film set. This was real life with real stakes. "Ma'am, your grandson has shared some concerning information with me," Denzel said, his voice low but authoritative. "He believes his mother is in danger." The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, shook her head, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. "Oh dear, not this again. Elijah has an active imagination. His mother is simply at work." Denzel covered the phone's microphone. He gave specific details that a child wouldn't typically invent. "I've contacted the police and they're on their way." Margaret's expression hardened. "That wasn't necessary. You've been misled by a child's fantasy." Elijah, still clutching his teddy bear, looked up at his grandmother with pleading eyes. "Grandma, I saw it. The man with the scar took Mommy," she screamed. "Elijah, stop it." Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. "Your mother is fine. She texted me just an hour ago." Denzel watched this exchange carefully, noting the grandmother's increasing agitation. Something didn't add up. His years of studying human behavior for his roles had made him keenly attuned to the subtle tells of deception or fear. "Sir, are you still there?" The dispatcher's voice came through the phone. "Yes, I'm here. The boy's grandmother has arrived and claims his mother is safe, but the child is insistent." The dispatcher responded promptly. "Officers should arrive within 5 minutes. Please keep everyone there until they arrive." Denzel guided Margaret and Elijah to his table, away from curious onlookers who had begun to recognize him. A McDonald's employee, sensing the tension, approached cautiously. "Is everything all right, sir? Would you like me to move you to our office for privacy?" Denzel nodded gratefully. "That would be helpful, thank you." As they were escorted to a small office behind the counter, Margaret continued protesting. "This is unnecessary. I don't understand why you're taking a child's words so seriously." Once inside, Denzel sat down across from Margaret and Elijah. He leaned forward, his expression compassionate but firm. "Margaret, I understand your concern, but I've played enough law enforcement roles to know that children often notice things adults miss." Elijah described a man with a scar taking his mother to a building with red doors near water. "That's very specific." Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. "Look, see for yourself. My daughter texted me at 3:24 p.m. She showed Denzel the screen displaying a message. "Working late tonight. Please feed Elijah dinner. Love you both." Denzel studied the message while Elijah fidgeted beside his grandmother. Something in the boy's posture caught Denzel's attention. A look of guilt mixed with determination. "Elijah, do you know something about this text?" Denzel asked gently. The boy looked down at his shoes, then at his grandmother, then finally at Denzel. "I sent it," he whispered. "I know Mommy's password. I wanted Grandma not to worry." Margaret gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "Elijah, what are you saying?" "Mommy showed me how to use her phone in case of emergency," Elijah explained, his voice growing stronger. "The man came this morning after you went to the store, Grandma. He had a big scar here." He traced a line from his eye to his jaw. "He told Mommy she had to go with him, or he would hurt me." Denzel felt a chill run down his spine. This was no childish fantasy. The details were too precise, the emotions too raw. Margaret's face paled as the implications sank in. But who would take Vanessa?" Elijah's next words made the room go still. "Daddy's friend, the one who came to our house before." Denzel watched as recognition dawned on Margaret's face, followed by horror. "Michael," she whispered. "Vanessa's ex-boyfriend." "He said Mommy belongs to him," Elijah continued, his small voice gaining confidence now that the adults were listening. "He said they were going to the place with the red doors where Daddy used to work." A knock at the office door interrupted them. 2 police officers entered, a tall African-American man with a senior officer's bearing, and a younger Latina woman, whose observant eyes quickly assessed the room. "Mr. Washington," the male officer said, extending his hand. "I'm Officer Davis, this is Officer Rodriguez. Dispatch filled us in on the basics. Can you explain the situation?" Denzel quickly recounted what Elijah had told him, with Margaret adding details about Michael, a volatile man with a criminal record who had dated Vanessa briefly after her divorce. The relationship had ended badly 6 months ago when Vanessa had filed a restraining order against him. Officer Rodriguez knelt beside Elijah. "Can you tell me more about what you saw this morning?" she asked gently. As Elijah repeated his story, Officer Davis stepped outside to make a call. When he returned minutes later, his expression had grown more serious. "We've just confirmed that Vanessa Mitchell didn't show up for her shift at Atlanta Memorial Hospital today. Her supervisor called it in as unusual, since she's never missed. Work without notice." Margaret collapsed into her chair, her earlier denial giving way to terrible certainty. "Oh God, Vanessa," she whispered. Denzel felt the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. What had begun as a simple stop for a quiet meal had transformed into something far more grave. He thought of all the scripts he'd read over his decades-long career. The fictional hostage situations, the dramatic rescues, the last-minute saves. None of those prepared him for the real fear in Margaret's eyes or the courage in Elijah's small face. Officer Davis turned to Denzel. "Mr. Washington, we appreciate your involvement, but we'll take it from here. You're free to go." Denzel looked at Elijah, who was watching him with complete trust in his eyes. The boy had sought him out specifically. Believing in the hero he portrayed on screen, Denzel made his decision. "I'd like to help if I can," he said firmly. "Elijah came to me for a reason." As Officer Rodriguez began coordinating with dispatch to initiate a missing persons investigation, Denzel placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. The boy looked up at him, hope shining through his fear. "We're going to find your mum," Denzel promised quietly, "just like in the movies." The McDonald's office had transformed into an impromptu command center. Officer Rodriguez sat with Elijah, gently coaxing more details from him, while Officer Davis coordinated with dispatch. Margaret paced the small room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she tried repeatedly to call her daughter's number. Denzel observed it all with the focused attention he typically reserved for studying complex characters. Every detail mattered now. The way Elijah's small fingers nervously twisted the ear of his teddy bear, the subtle shake in Margaret's voice, the professional efficiency of the officers. "Can you tell me more about this man with the scar, Elijah?" "Officer," Rodriguez asked, her voice gentle but direct. She had positioned herself at eye level with the boy, a notebook open on her knee. Elijah looked at Denzel, who nodded encouragingly. "He's tall. Taller than Mommy, but not as tall as him." Elijah pointed at Denzel. "His scar is red and goes from here to here." He traced a line from the corner of his right eye down to his jaw, and he has a picture on his arm. Elijah pointed to his forearm. "A snake that moves when he bends his arm," Officer Rodriguez wrote quickly. "That's very helpful, Elijah. You're doing great." Officer Davis stepped back into the room, his expression grave as he addressed Margaret. "Ma'am, we've entered your daughter's information into our system. We've also dispatched officers to her home to secure the scene and look for evidence." Margaret nodded, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. "What about Michael? Are you looking for him?" "We're trying to locate Michael Torres now. His last known address is being checked as we speak." Officer Davis turned to Denzel. "Mr. Washington, I understand you want to help, but I need to emphasize that this is now an active police investigation." Denzel nodded, understanding the officer's position. "I respect that, officer, but Elijah came to me for a reason. I'd like to see this through, at least until his mother is found." Before Officer Davis could respond, the McDonald's manager knocked and entered, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are reporters gathering outside. Someone must have called them about Mr. Washington being here." Denzel's jaw tightened. The last thing this situation needed was media attention that might spook Michael. "We need to move to the precinct," Officer Davis decided. "We can continue the interview there, away from prying eyes." As they prepared to leave through the rear exit, Officer Rodriguez's radio crackled. She stepped aside to listen, then returned with new urgency in her movements. "We've got a hit on Michael Torres," she reported. "His car was spotted heading east on Interstate 20 about 40 minutes ago. And there's more. He's got priors: assault, breaking and entering, and a domestic violence charge that was dropped when the witness refused to testify." Margaret sank into a chair. "Vanessa never told me about any domestic violence. She said they broke up because he was too controlling." "Victims often hide the full extent of abuse from family," Officer Rodriguez explained gently. Elijah, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "The Red Door place is where Daddy used to take me to see the boats." All eyes turned to him. "What boats, sweetie?" Margaret asked. "The big ones. Daddy worked there before he went to heaven. The building has red doors, and it's by the water where the boats go." Officer Davis and Rodriguez exchanged glances. "Sounds like he could be describing the Riverport district," Davis said. "There are several warehouses there, some with loading docks for the barges." Vanessa's late husband, Elijah's father, worked as a freight manager at the port before he died, Margaret explained. 2 years ago. Heart attack. Denzel noticed something shift in Elijah's expression, a sadness mixed with determination. Beyond his years, this child had already lost one parent. He was fighting with everything he had not to lose another. As they moved toward the exit, Denzel felt his phone vibrate. A text from his assistant. "Are you okay? Seeing reports you're involved in police situation at McDonald's." He quickly replied, "I'm fine. Don't share any details with press." Then he switched his phone to silent. 2 police cruisers waited in the back lot. Margaret and Elijah were directed into one with Officer Rodriguez, while Denzel was asked to ride with Officer Davis. "We'll escort you to the precinct, Mr. Washington," Davis explained. "You can give a formal statement there." "Before we go, I need to understand something," Denzel said quietly, ensuring they were out of Elijah's earshot. "Based on what we know, how much danger is Vanessa in?" Officer Davis's professional demeanor slipped just enough to reveal his concern. "Torres has a violent history. If he's taken her to an isolated location, and if he believes she's completely under his control—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Then time is critical," Denzel concluded. Davis nodded grimly. "Exactly." As they pulled away from the McDonald's, Denzel caught sight of several news vans arriving. The story was breaking whether they wanted it to, or not. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere shifted to one of focused urgency. Elijah and Margaret were taken to a comfortable room designed for interviewing children. Bright colors, stuffed animals, and drawing supplies helped make the space less intimidating. Denzel was directed to an adjacent room where he could watch through a one-way mirror as Detective Sarah Winters, a specialist in child interviews, spoke with Elijah. Officer Davis stood beside him. "Your involvement has certainly accelerated this case," Davis commented. "It might have been hours before anyone realized Vanessa was missing otherwise." On the other side of the glass, Detective Winters laid out a map of the river district. "Elijah, can you show me where the building with the red doors might be?" The boy studied the map with surprising focus for a 5-year-old. His small finger hovered over the paper before landing decisively on a section of the port. "This looks like where Daddy worked. The red doors are here." Detective Winters made a note. "And you're sure that's where the man with the scar took your mum?" Elijah nodded. "He told her they were going to Daddy's special place where no one would find them." In the observation room, Officer Davis immediately picked up his radio. "I need units to check all warehouses in Section E of the Port District. Priority on any structures with red doors or markings." As the response came through confirming units were en route, Margaret entered the observation room, her face drawn with worry. "They've found Michael's car," she told Denzel and Officer Davis. "It was parked near one of the warehouses at the port. They're setting up a perimeter now." Denzel felt the weight of real-world consequences settling in. No script revisions, no second takes, no stunt doubles. Somewhere out there, a woman's life hung in the balance, and her 5-year-old son had placed his trust in Denzel to help save her. Officer Davis's phone rang. The conversation was brief, but his expression darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Denzel asked when he hung up. "Torres has a history with that specific warehouse. He worked security there after Elijah's father died. He knows the layout." Officer Davis paused. "And there's something else. A boat registered in his cousin's. Name is docked nearby. If he gets Vanessa on that boat..." The implication was clear. If Michael managed to get Vanessa onto a boat, the chances of finding her would diminish dramatically. Detective Winters exited the interview room and approached them, her expression grave. "We have a positive ID on Torres from a dock worker who saw him entering Warehouse 17 about 3 hours ago. He wasn't alone." "That's where my husband worked," Margaret whispered. "That's Elijah's father's special place." The atmosphere in the precinct grew increasingly tense as a tactical team was assembled to approach Warehouse 17. Detective Winters coordinated with the harbor patrol to monitor the boat registered to Torres's cousin, ensuring no one could leave by water. In a quiet corner of the station, Denzel sat with Elijah, who was coloring with crayons provided by a thoughtful officer. Margaret had stepped out to speak privately with Detective Winters. Despite the circumstances, Elijah displayed remarkable composure, though occasional glances toward the busy police officers revealed his underlying anxiety. "You're doing really well, Elijah," Denzel said gently. "The police are going to find your mum." Elijah looked up from his drawing, a figure of a woman with long brown hair standing next to a taller figure that resembled Denzel. "Are you going to help them?" the boy asked, his eyes full of innocent expectation. "In your movies, you always go with the police." Denzel smiled sadly. "Real life is different from movies, buddy. The police are trained for this. They know exactly what to do." Before Elijah could respond, Margaret returned, her face ashen. She motioned for Denzel to join her a few steps away. "They found something in my daughter's apartment," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Blood on the kitchen floor, not much, but—" She couldn't finish. Denzel felt his stomach tighten. "Have they told Elijah?" "No, and I don't want them to." Margaret glanced at her. "Grandson, he's been through enough." Officer Rodriguez approached them, her professional demeanor tempered with compassion. "Mr. Washington, we've received some concerning information. A burner phone was found in Michael Torres's car with several text messages that mention you specifically." "Me?" Denzel's brow furrowed in confusion. "I've never met Torres." "The messages suggest he somehow knew you were in Atlanta filming," Rodriguez explained. "One text sent yesterday reads, 'Washington's filming downtown, perfect timing.'" A cold realization washed over Denzel. "You think he planned this? That bringing Elijah to McDonald's where I might be wasn't a coincidence?" Rodriguez nodded grimly. "We believe Torres may have orchestrated this situation to involve you specifically. It's unclear why, but we're investigating possible connections." Denzel's mind raced. Throughout his career, he'd encountered obsessive fans and even a few concerning threats, but nothing that had materialized into actual danger. "I've played a lot of characters who take justice into their own hands," Denzel said slowly. "Some people have trouble separating fiction from reality." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. "Are you saying my daughter was kidnapped because of some sick fan's obsession with Denzel Washington?" "We don't know that for certain," Rodriguez cautioned, "but Torres's behavior suggests this may be more complex than a domestic dispute." Officer Davis joined them, bringing news from the tactical team. "We've got eyes on the warehouse. 2 individuals confirmed inside, 1 male fitting Torres's description and 1 female who appears to be restrained." "Vanessa," Margaret whispered. "They're preparing to move in, but they're proceeding with caution. Torres may be armed," Davis continued. "The boat remains secured. No one's getting away by water." Denzel noticed Elijah watching them intently, sensing the shift in the adult's demeanor. He walked back to the boy kneeling to his level. "Elijah, did you ever meet your mom's friend Michael before today?" The boy nodded slowly. "He came to our house sometimes. He told me he was going to be my new dad, but Mommy said no." "Did he ever talk about me, about my movies?" Elijah nodded again, more vigorously this time. "He watches your movies all the time. He says you understand, The boy struggled to remember the exact words. "Understand what, Elijah?" Denzel prompted gently. "That. Sometimes bad guys need to be stopped, not arrested." Elijah's innocent recitation of Torres's words sent a chill through the room. Denzel exchanged glances with Officers Davis and Rodriguez. The situation had just taken an even darker turn. "He told me if anything bad ever happened, I should find you," Elijah continued, his voice small but clear. "He said you would know what to do, just like in the movies." The pieces were falling into place. Torres had manipulated the child, using Denzel's screen persona as part of whatever twisted plan he'd conceived. "Mr. Washington," Officer Davis spoke quietly, "in light of this new information, we need to consider your safety as well. Torres may be trying to draw you in." "I'm already involved," Denzel replied firmly, and clearly that's what he wanted. Margaret, who had been listening silently, suddenly gasped as understanding dawned on her face. "The memorial service," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Last year, after Jason's funeral, Michael approached Vanessa. He said something about how much Jason had admired your work, how you portrayed men who protected their families at any cost." Denzel remembered the role Margaret was likely referencing, a vigilante father in one of his more controversial films. a character who had taken brutal revenge against those who had harmed his family. Elijah, Denzel turned back to the boy. Does your mom have a phone that's just for emergencies? One that maybe Grandma doesn't know about? Elijah's eyes widened. Slightly. The special phone, it's in my teddy. Before anyone could react, Elijah turned his well-worn teddy bear upside down and unzipped a small opening in the seam. From inside, he pulled out a basic flip phone. Officer Rodriguez quickly donned gloves and took the phone, opening it to find a single saved number and several text messages. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as she scrolled through them. These are from Torres to Vanessa, she confirmed. The most recent was sent 3 hours ago. Tell the boy it's time. He knows what to do. Denzel felt a surge of anger. Torres had used an innocent child as a pawn, implanting instructions and manipulating his trust. He told me that if the bad man ever came, I needed to use the special phone and then find you, Elijah explained, his eyes filling with tears. I did what he said. Was that wrong? Denzel placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. No, buddy. You did exactly right. You're helping your mom more than you know. Detective Winters returned with an evidence bag containing Vanessa's regular phone, recovered from her apartment. We've accessed her messages. Torres has been threatening her for months, but there's something else. She handed a printed transcript to Officer Davis. Look at the dates. Davis scanned the document, his expression darkening. These threats began right after Vanessa received a substantial life insurance payout from her husband's policy. That's what this is about? Margaret asked incredulously. Money? Money may be part of it, Detective Winters replied. But based on the messages, Torres seems to have developed a fixation on both the money and on a fantasy of protecting Vanessa and Elijah, a distorted version of the characters Mr. Washington often portrays. The tactical team leader's voice came through on Davis's radio. We're in position, preparing to breach in 5 minutes. Denzel watched as Elijah clutched his now empty teddy bear, the child's eyes reflecting both fear and hope. Whatever twisted, a game Torres was playing. It had placed an innocent woman's life at risk and traumatized her son. What does he want from me? Denzel asked quietly. Detective Winters met his gaze steadily. Based on his messages, he seems to want you to witness his heroism. He's created a scenario where he can rescue Vanessa from a fictional threat with you as the audience. That makes no sense, Margaret protested. He's the one who took her. Someone in Torres's psychological state, reality becomes malleable, Winters explained. He's writing his own script with himself as the hero. Denzel felt the weight of realization. And I'm supposed to be the one who validates his performance. The precinct hummed with focused energy as the tactical operation moved forward. Denzel stood by the Situation Room window, watching the monitors displaying the warehouse perimeter. The SWAT team had taken positions around Warehouse 17, their movements precise and deliberate. Mr. Washington, Captain Reynolds, the tactical team leader, approached with a tablet. Before we proceed, there's something you should see. On the screen was a social media profile, Michael Torres's private account that their tech team had just accessed. The page was filled with photos of Denzel from his various films, particularly those where he portrayed characters seeking justice, outside the law. Interspersed were rambling posts about real heroes and necessary action. Torres has been obsessed with your vigilante roles for years, Reynolds explained, but it goes deeper than we thought. Reynolds swiped to reveal another image, a younger Torres standing next to a man who looked strikingly similar to Elijah's late father. Jason Mitchell and Michael Torres served together in the military, Reynolds continued. They were in the same unit in Afghanistan. According to military records, there was an incident where their patrol was ambushed. 3 men died, but Mitchell survived. Denzel studied the photo closely. Torres feels responsible for what happened to Jason. We think so. And based on his posts, he's created a narrative where he needs to protect Jason's family as some form of redemption. Margaret, who had been speaking with Detective Winters nearby, approached upon hearing Jason's name. Vanessa never mentioned Michael knowing Jason from the military, she said, confusion evident in her voice. Detective Winters nodded grimly. People with obsessive tendencies often concealed important information to control their narratives. Torres likely presented himself to Vanessa as someone new in her life, not a connection to her past. Officer Rodriguez entered with a file folder. "We've got more." Torres wasn't just Jason Mitchell's military buddy. He was supposed to be on point the day of the ambush. According to survivor statements, he missed warning signs that could have prevented the attack. The pieces were falling into place. Torres wasn't just a man fixated on Denzel's fictional characters. He was someone carrying profound guilt, attempting to rewrite his personal history through a distorted lens of heroism. After Jason died of a heart attack, Torres must have seen it as another failure, Detective Winters theorized. Another person he couldn't save. Denzel thought of the boy in the other room, innocently coloring while adults unraveled the twisted psychology that had put his mother in danger. "So this isn't really about the insurance money," Denzel said quietly. "The money may be part of it," Rodriguez replied. "But this seems more about Torres creating a scenario where he finally gets to be the hero, saving Vanessa from some imagined threat, with you as witness to his redemption." "Except there is no threat, except the one he created," Denzel observed, the irony not lost on him. Captain Reynolds' radio crackled with an update from the tactical team. "Thermal imaging confirms 2 individuals inside the office area of the warehouse. Female subject appears to be seated. Male subject is moving around the space. No weapons visible from our vantage point." Reynolds turned to Denzel. "Mr. Washington, I understand your desire to help, but I need to emphasize that you should remain here while we handle the extraction." Denzel nodded, but his mind was working through the psychological profile they'd assembled of Torres. What if he's expecting me to be there? If this is about validation in his mind, what happens when his audience doesn't show up? The question hung in the air as Captain Reynolds considered the implications. Before he could respond, Officer Davis entered with his phone extended. "It's Torres," he said tensely. "He's demanding to speak with Mr. Washington." The room fell silent as Denzel took the phone. Reynolds quickly motioned for the tech team to begin a trace and recording. "This is Denzel Washington," he said, his voice calm and controlled, the same tone he'd used in countless negotiation scenes throughout his career, now applied to a terrifyingly real situation. "I knew you'd come through." Torres's voice held an unsettling familiarity, as if he were speaking to an old friend. "The boy did good, didn't he? Smart kid, just like his father." "Michael, I'm here to talk about Vanessa," Denzel responded evenly. "Is she all right?" "She's fine," Torres replied dismissively. "This was never about hurting her, it's about saving her, something you understand better than most." Denzel caught Reynolds' eye as the captain pointed to a note indicating they needed to keep Torres talking, while the tactical team moved into position. "I do understand wanting to protect people," Denzel said carefully. "But real protection doesn't involve fear or force." Torres laughed, a hollow sound. "That's not what you showed in Equalizer or Man on Fire. Sometimes force is exactly what's needed. Sometimes the system fails, and men need to step up. Those are characters, Michael." "Fiction." "Fiction based on truth," Torres countered. "You know it, I know it. The world needs men willing to do what others won't." Denzel kept his voice level. "Is that what Jason would want for Vanessa and Elijah? Fear? Trauma?" The mention of Jason's name triggered a noticeable shift in Torres's tone. "Don't talk about what Jason would want. I knew him. I was there when you couldn't save him," Denzel ventured carefully. Silence stretched across the line before Torres spoke again, his voice harder. "You don't know anything about that day." "I know guilt can eat at a man," Denzel replied. "Make him see things that aren't there. Make him try to fix what can't be fixed." Another long pause. Reynolds gave a thumbs up. They had traced the call and confirmed Torres was indeed inside Warehouse 17. "I promised him," Torres finally said, his voice suddenly vulnerable. "In his last moments, I promised Jason I'd look after them if anything happened. But he didn't die that day in Afghanistan, did he?" Denzel said gently. "He came home, had a heart attack years later. You couldn't have prevented that, Michael." Torres's breathing grew audible through the phone. "You don't understand, it's all connected. The stress, the nightmares, they never stopped for him. What happened over there killed him just as surely as if he'd died that day. Reynolds showed Denzel another note. SWAT in position, ready to breach. Michael, let me help you make this right, Denzel offered. Let Vanessa go and we can talk. Soldier to soldier. The last part was a calculated risk. Denzel had portrayed military men enough times that Torres might accept the fictional connection. No, Torres replied, his voice suddenly firmer. You need to see what's happening here. You need to witness it. That's why I chose you. Then let me come to you, Denzel suggested, ignoring Reynolds' alarmed expression. Just me, no police. The proposal was met with several seconds of silence before Torres responded. South entrance. 10 minutes, come alone or she gets hurt. The line went dead. Reynolds immediately objected. Absolutely not. We're not sending a civilian into a hostage situation. Denzel met his gaze steadily. He's created an entire scenario with me in it. If I don't play my part, there's no telling what he'll do. Detective Winters, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Torres has constructed a narrative where Mr. Washington's character, not Mr. Washington himself, but the archetypal hero he represents, validates Torres's actions. Breaking that narrative could destabilize him. Reynolds shook his head. Firmly. It's too dangerous. Denzel looked through the glass partition to where Elijah sat with a social worker, still clutching his teddy bear. The boy looked up at that exact moment, his eyes meeting Denzel's with complete trust. What if we could give Torres what he wants while keeping everyone safe? Denzel asked quietly. You're suggesting a controlled encounter, Captain Reynolds said, studying Denzel's face carefully. They had moved to a private strategy room away from Margaret and Elijah. It's too unpredictable. Torres has created this entire scenario with me at the center, Denzel replied. His fixation gives us an advantage. Detective Winters nodded slowly. Mr. Washington is right. Torres is living in a narrative where he's the misunderstood hero. If we can work within that framework, rather than shatter it abruptly, we might be able to de-escalate. Reynolds remained skeptical. And if he decides his hero's journey requires a tragic ending, that's why I'll be wearing a wire, Denzel said firmly. Your team will hear everything. The moment things go sideways, they move in. After several tense minutes of debate, Reynolds reluctantly agreed to the plan. Time was running out and they had limited options. A technician quickly fitted Denzel with a concealed microphone and earpiece. The wire is undetectable unless he searches you thoroughly, the technician explained. The earpiece allows us to communicate with you discreetly. Officer Rodriguez approached with a tactical vest. You should wear this under your jacket. Denzel shook his head. Torres will be looking for signs of police involvement. If he sees anything suspicious, Vanessa pays the price. As the team reviewed the warehouse layout one final time, Denzel stepped away briefly to speak with Margaret and Elijah. The boy looked up as Denzel entered, his eyes brightening despite the circumstances. Are you going to bring my mom back now? Elijah asked, the innocent question carrying the weight of an entire world. Denzel knelt to the boy's level. I'm going to do everything I can to help her come home to you, he promised, careful not to make guarantees he couldn't keep. Margaret's eyes were filled with worry. They told me what you're planning. It's too dangerous. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is doing nothing, Denzel replied quietly. He turned back to Elijah. Can I borrow your teddy bear? I think it might help your mom feel better. Elijah hesitated only briefly before handing over his beloved companion. Tell her I'm waiting. Denzel nodded solemnly, tucking the small bear into his jacket pocket. I will. Back in the strategy room, final preparations were underway. The tactical team would position themselves around the warehouse, ready to breach at the first sign of trouble. Snipers would maintain sight lines through the windows, though their ability to get a clear shot would depend on where Torres kept. Vanessa, remember, our priority is extracting the hostage safely, Reynolds emphasized. Torres is unstable, but he specifically requested your presence. Use that connection to keep him talking. Denzel nodded, his mind already shifting into the focused state he typically reserved for his most demanding roles. But this wasn't a film set, and there would be no director calling cut if things went wrong. As they prepared to leave, Detective Winters pulled Denzel aside. We've been analyzing Torres's social media posts more deeply. There's something you should know. She handed him a printout. These are the films of yours he references most frequently. Notice anything? Denzel scanned the list, recognition dawning. They all feature scenes where my character uses specific phrases to diffuse volatile situations. Winters nodded. Torres may be expecting you to say certain lines. If you recognize an opening, use it. It might help reinforce his fictional narrative long enough for us to get Vanessa out safely. The convoy moved out, maintaining radio silence. As they approached the port district, 2 blocks from the warehouse, they stopped. Denzel would continue alone from here, walking the final distance to maintain the appearance that he had come without police backup. Testing communications, the key, tech specialist said through Denzel's earpiece. I hear you, Denzel confirmed quietly. Captain Reynolds gave final instructions. Stay at least 6 feet from Torres at all times. Keep him talking. If you say the phrase, I understand your position, that's our signal to move in immediately. Denzel nodded, buttoning his jacket and beginning the walk toward the warehouse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the industrial buildings, the river glistening in the distance. The large structure with red loading bay doors stood isolated at the end of the access road. I see movement inside, came a sniper's voice through his earpiece. Torres is pacing near the east window. The female hostage appears conscious, seated, approximately 15 feet from him. Denzel approached the south entrance, a smaller personnel door beside the main loading bay. He took a deep breath, centering himself before knocking firmly. The door opened almost immediately. Michael Torres stood before him, a man in his late 30s with military posture and a jagged scar running down the right side of his face. His eyes held the intense focus of someone existing in a reality slightly different from everyone else's. You actually came alone, Torres said, surprise evident in his voice. I didn't think you would. I keep my word, Denzel replied evenly. Just like my characters do. Torres smiled, a disconcertingly normal expression on a man in such an abnormal situation. Come in, she's waiting. Denzel entered, taking in the warehouse interior with a practiced eye. The cavernous space was mostly empty except for some abandoned shipping equipment. In what had once been an office area, Vanessa Mitchell sat in a chair, her hands bound before her. She looked exhausted and frightened, but there were no visible injuries. Vanessa, Denzel called. Your son wanted me to tell you he's waiting for you. Her eyes widened at the mention of Elijah. He's safe? He's with your mother at the police station, Denzel assured her. He's the one who found me, just like Michael planned. Torres nodded approvingly. Smart kid, just like his father. Why don't you tell me about Jason? Denzel suggested, moving carefully into the space while maintaining distance from Torres. I'd like to understand what happened between you two. Torres's expression darkened. We were brothers in everything but blood. When the ambush happened, I was supposed to be watching our 6. I missed the signs. His voice dropped to a near whisper. 3 men died because I wasn't paying attention. But Jason survived, Denzel noted. He lived, but he was never the same. The nightmares, the anxiety, it destroyed him from the inside out. Torres began pacing again. When he died, I promised I'd look after them, but Vanessa wouldn't let me help. So you decided to force your help on her, Denzel said, carefully neutral. Torres stopped pacing, his expression hardening. Sometimes people don't know what they need. Sometimes they have to be saved from themselves. Through his earpiece, Reynolds whispered, Keep him talking. SWAT team is in position. Denzel took a deliberate step closer to Vanessa. Is that what Jason would have wanted? For his wife to be frightened? For his son to be traumatized? Torres's face contorted with conflicting emotions. You don't understand, there are threats everywhere. I'm the only one who can protect them properly. What threats, Michael? Denzel asked gently. The war is over. You're home now. Torres shook his head vehemently. The war is never over. You've shown that in your films. There are always enemies. Always people who want to hurt those who can't protect themselves. Vanessa spoke up suddenly, her voice strained but determined. Michael, please, if you ever truly cared about Jason, let me go back to my son. Torres turned to her, his expression softening momentarily before hardening again. I'm doing this. For Jason. For all of you. We're running out of time, Reynolds warned in Denzel's ear. The harbor patrol reports increased activity on the cousin's boat. Someone just started the engines. Denzel realized Torres might have an escape plan via the water. He needed to act now. Michael, Denzel said, projecting the calm authority that had defined so many of his iconic roles. Let's talk about what happens next. What's your plan here? Torres glanced toward the window facing the harbor, confirming Denzel's suspicion about an escape route. I've secured passage for the three of us, somewhere safe where I can fulfill my promise to Jason properly. 3 of us, Denzel asked, carefully positioning himself to block Torres's direct path to Vanessa. You're coming too, Torres stated, as if it were an obvious fact. You understand what I'm doing. You can explain it to her, to the world. The delusion had progressed further than they'd anticipated. In Torres's mind, Denzel wasn't just a witness, but a participant in his twisted narrative. Michael, I have a career responsibilities, Denzel replied evenly. I can't just disappear. Torres's expression darkened. You've played men who gave up everything for what's right. This is your chance to live that truth. Through the earpiece, Captain Reynolds' voice was tense. We need to move soon. The boat is ready to depart, and we've identified a second individual on board, likely the cousin. Denzel needed to keep Torres talking while moving closer to Vanessa. He reached into his pocket and produced Elijah's teddy bear. Your son wanted you to have this, he said to Vanessa, taking a step toward her. Her eyes filled with tears as she recognized the stuffed animal. Thank you, she whispered. Torres watched this exchange, momentarily distracted by the emotional moment. Denzel used the opportunity to take another step closer to Vanessa. You know, Michael, Denzel continued, I've been thinking about what you said about Jason, about the promise you made to him. Torres's attention snapped back to Denzel. What about it? In The Equalizer, Denzel referenced one of the films Torres had fixated on. My character says something important. Progress, not perfection. Do you remember that line? Torres nodded slowly, recognition lighting his eyes. When he's helping the young girl escape her handlers. Exactly, Denzel affirmed. Sometimes protecting someone means letting them make their own choices, helping them find their own path. Torres seemed to consider this, his expression conflicted. Denzel had successfully tapped into the narrative framework that governed Torres's reality. Jason wouldn't want Vanessa and Elijah living in fear, Denzel continued, taking another careful step toward Vanessa. He'd want them to be happy, to be free. They're not safe without me, Torres insisted, though with less conviction than before. Vanessa spoke up, her voice steadier now. Michael, Jason loved you like a brother. He told me how you saved his life during the ambush, how you pulled him to safety when others couldn't make it. This new information momentarily stunned Denzel. The narrative Torres had constructed, that he had failed Jason, was apparently inverted from the truth. He said that, Torres asked, his voice suddenly vulnerable. Many times, Vanessa confirmed. He never blamed you for what happened. Never. Torres's composure began to crack, years of self-recrimination colliding with this revelation. But the nightmares, the anxiety that led to his heart attack, were part of the war, Vanessa finished gently. Not your fault, never your fault. Denzel watched this exchange carefully, recognizing the critical moment unfolding. Torres's elaborate justification for his actions was beginning to unravel. Torres is becoming unstable, Reynolds warned through the earpiece. Be ready for us to move in. Michael, Denzel said, deliberately using a line from another film Torres would recognize, sometimes the hardest thing about being a hero is knowing when to walk away. Torres's eyes locked with Denzel's, searching for something. You really believe that? I do, Denzel affirmed. The true measure of strength is knowing when to let go. For a moment, the warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of water lapping against the dock. Torres seemed frozen in indecision, caught between his delusion and the painful truth. Then, without warning, Torres reached behind his back and pulled out a handgun. Everyone's lying to me, he said, his voice eerily calm. Everyone except Jason, and he's gone. Denzel raised his hands slowly, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Michael, think about what you're doing. This isn't what Jason would want. I understand your position, Denzel said clearly, the predetermined signal for immediate intervention. But Torres caught the subtle shift in Denzel's demeanor. They're coming, aren't they? You brought them with you. His grip on the gun tightened. No, one needs to get hurt here, Denzel insisted, taking a deliberate step to position himself between the gun and Vanessa. Jason wouldn't want anyone else to die. Torres's hand trembled slightly. I just wanted to keep my promise, that's all I ever wanted. You can still honor Jason in the right way, Denzel said, drawing on every ounce of his persuasive ability, by letting Vanessa and Elijah live in peace. Outside, the tactical team had begun to move into position. Through his earpiece, Denzel could hear Reynolds coordinating the breach. They would enter in 30 seconds. It's over, Michael, Denzel said gently, but it can end without more pain. Torres looked toward the harbor, then back at Vanessa, his expression cycling through rage, grief, and finally, a terrible resignation. Tell Elijah about his father, Torres said to Vanessa. Tell him how brave Jason was, not just in war, but every day after, fighting the battle in his mind. Before Denzel could respond, Torres raised the gun, not toward them, but to his own. Temple! No! Denzel lunged forward, driven by instinct rather than calculation. The warehouse door burst open as the SWAT team breached from multiple entry points. The sudden chaos disoriented Torres just enough for Denzel to reach him, grabbing his wrist and forcing the gun upward as it discharged. The bullet tore through the metal roof above them. Torres struggled against Denzel's grip, his military training, evident in his strength and technique. They grappled for control of the weapon, as tactical officers rushed toward them, Vanessa screaming in the background. It wasn't supposed to end this way, Torres growled, still fighting for the gun. Here doesn't have to, Denzel replied through gritted teeth. A tactical officer reached them, helping Denzel subdue Torres. Another team member secured the weapon, while others cut Vanessa free from her restraints. As Torres was pinned to the ground and handcuffed, his eyes never left Denzel's. You would have done the same, he insisted. For family, your characters always do. Denzel knelt beside the restrained man, speaking low enough that only Torres could hear. My characters aren't real, but Jason was. And he wouldn't want this. For his friend. Something in Torres seemed to break then, not violently but like a fever finally breaking after a long illness. The delusion that had sustained him began to dissolve, leaving only a broken man in its wake. I'm sorry, Torres whispered as officers helped him to his feet. Tell Elijah. Tell him I'm sorry. As Torres was led away, Denzel turned to Vanessa, who was being examined by a medic. Are you all right? She nodded, clutching Elijah's teddy bear to her chest. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion, for understanding him enough to reach him. Outside, Captain Reynolds approached Denzel. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen a civilian do, he said, though there was respect in his voice. When he pulled that gun, sometimes you have to trust what you know about people, Denzel replied quietly, even when they're lost. As the warehouse erupted with activity, tactical officers securing the scene, medics attending to Vanessa, and Torres being led away in handcuffs, Denzel found himself in a surreal moment of quiet amid the chaos. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation began to ebb, leaving him acutely aware of how differently things could have ended. Captain Reynolds approached, extending a bottle of water. That was some negotiation work, he said, his professional demeanor softened with genuine respect. You reached him in a way none of my trained officers could have. Denzel accepted the water gratefully. He didn't want to hurt anyone, not really. He was trapped in a story he couldn't escape. A story with you at the center, Reynolds noted. Our psychologist will want to debrief with you when we get back to the station. Across the warehouse, Vanessa sat wrapped in a shock blanket, a paramedic checking her vitals. Though physically unharmed beyond some bruising from the restraints, her eyes held the distant look of someone processing trauma. When she noticed Denzel watching, she offered a small nod of gratitude. Officer Rodriguez approached with news from the Harbor Patrol. They've apprehended Torres's cousin on the boat, found fake passports and enough supplies for several weeks at sea. They were planning to disappear completely. Where was he planning to go? Denzel asked. South, along the coast, eventually to a private island in the Caribbean that the cousin apparently leases. Rodriguez shook her head. Torres had been planning this for months. Bank records show he'd liquidated everything he owned. The revelation underscored the depth of Torres's delusion, a meticulously orchestrated fantasy of rescue and escape, with Denzel cast as the validating witness to his heroism. As they prepared to leave the warehouse, Denzel paused beside Torres, who sat handcuffed in the back of a police car, his earlier intensity now replaced with a hollow resignation. "May I speak with him?" Denzel asked the officer standing guard. After receiving approval, Denzel approached the open door of the police car. Torres looked up, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't supposed to end this way," Torres said quietly. "In your scenario, how did it end?" Denzel asked, genuinely curious about the narrative Torres had constructed. Torres stared past Denzel toward the harbor. "You would see that I was right, that I was the only one who could truly protect them. You would help explain to Vanessa why she needed me." He laughed bitterly. "Ridiculous, isn't it? When I say it out loud, we all create stories to make sense of our pain," Denzel replied. "Yours just went too far." Torres met his gaze directly. "In your films, men like me get second chances." "This isn't a film," Denzel said gently. "But second chances do exist in real life too. They just look different than you might expect, as..." The police car door closed. Denzel felt the weight of Torres's misguided faith, not just in Denzel's screen personas, but in the simplistic moral universe where heroism was measured by willingness to take extreme action. The convoy returned to the police station, where Margaret and Elijah were waiting. The moment Vanessa entered the room, Elijah broke free from his grandmother's hold and ran to his mother, colliding with her in a desperate embrace that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. "Mommy, you're okay," Elijah cried, his small hands touching her face, as if to confirm she was really there. "Yes, baby, I'm okay," Vanessa assured him, kneeling to his level despite her exhaustion. "And I hear you were very brave." Elijah nodded solemnly before turning to Denzel. "You brought Teddy back too," he observed, noting the stuffed bear that Vanessa still clutched. "He helped keep your mum safe," Denzel replied, kneeling beside them, "just like you helped by finding me." Margaret joined the reunion, embracing her daughter with quiet sobs of relief. The family huddled together, the bonds between them visibly strengthening through the shared trauma and relief. Detective Winters approached, waiting respectfully until the family had their moment before addressing Denzel. "We'd like to get your official statement while everything's still fresh," she said. "Then you're free to go." The debriefing was thorough but efficient. Denzel recounted the events in the warehouse, paying particular attention to Torres's psychological state and the techniques he'd used to connect with the man's delusions. "You essentially performed therapy under extreme duress," noted Dr. Chen, the department's psychologist who had joined the debriefing, "using his fixation on your film roles to gradually bring him back to reality." "I just tried to meet him where he was," Denzel explained. "In his mind, he was the hero of the story. Challenging that directly would have escalated the situation." After completing his statement, Denzel prepared to leave. The film set would be waiting for him tomorrow, the crew doubtless buzzing with news of his unexpected adventure. As surreal as the day had been, part of him already recognized it would soon feel like a distant dream, much like the roles he played on screen. Before he could exit, Margaret approached him, her eyes red but clear. "I don't know how to thank you," she said simply. "When Elijah wandered off in that McDonald's, I was terrified he'd get lost or hurt. I never imagined he'd find exactly the person who could save my daughter." "Elijah is an extraordinary child," Denzel replied. "He knew exactly what to do in an impossible situation." Margaret nodded, pride mixing with her exhaustion. "Vanessa would like to speak with you if you have a moment." In a quiet corner of the station, Vanessa sat with Elijah sleeping against her shoulder, emotionally drained but unwilling to let go of his mother even in sleep. "I wanted to thank you," she said as Denzel sat beside her, "not just for today but for understanding Michael enough to save him from himself." Denzel raised an eyebrow, surprised by her concern for the man who had kidnapped her. Jason loved him like a brother, Vanessa explained. He would have been devastated if Michael had died today, especially thinking he had failed somehow. She stroked Elijah's hair gently. I don't forgive what he did, but I understand the broken place it came from. Her compassion was remarkable given the circumstances, a testament to the complex bonds formed in combat and their enduring impact on those left behind. What will happen to him? Denzel asked. The prosecutor is already talking about mandatory psychiatric treatment as part of any plea deal, Vanessa replied. I won't oppose it. Elijah has lost enough father figures. As they spoke, Captain Reynolds approached with unexpected news. The media has gotten wind of what happened, he said, apologetically to Denzel. There's quite a crowd of reporters outside. Denzel considered this development. His involvement would inevitably become public knowledge. There was no avoiding the spotlight now. If it's all right with you, he said to Vanessa, I'd like to make a brief statement emphasizing Elijah's bravery rather than the details of what happened in that warehouse. Your family deserves privacy to heal. Vanessa nodded gratefully. Thank you. For everything. As Denzel prepared to face the waiting reporters, he glanced back at Elijah sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. The boy had approached him in a McDonald's, believing the heroes Denzel portrayed on screen were real. In doing so, he had given Denzel the rare opportunity to bridge the gap between fiction and reality, to truly be the hero a child believed him to be. 2 days after the warehouse confrontation, Atlanta Memorial Hospital hosted a quieter, more controlled reunion. Vanessa had been admitted for observation, the doctors concerned about her elevated stress levels and the possibility of delayed trauma responses. Her hospital room had been transformed by Elijah's artwork, colorful drawings taped to nearly every available surface, most featuring variations of his mother, his grandmother, and a tall figure labeled Mr. Denzel. Outside, the media presence had finally begun to disperse. Denzel's brief but powerful statement after the rescue had struck the perfect tone, redirecting attention to Elijah's bravery and the effective work of law enforcement while respectfully requesting privacy for the family. Still, the story had captured national attention. Hollywood icon becomes real-life hero. Denzel arrived at the hospital without fanfare, having coordinated his visit through Captain Reynolds to avoid publicity. The film's production had graciously rescheduled his scenes, recognizing the exceptional circumstances. As he walked through the hospital corridor carrying a gift bag, several staff members did double takes, but respectfully maintained their professional composure. When he reached Vanessa's room, he found her sitting up in bed, looking remarkably more relaxed than the last time he'd seen her. Elijah was curled beside her on the bed, focused intently on a tablet where they appeared to be reading a story together. Margaret sat nearby, her vigilant attention to her daughter and grandson, testament to how deeply the events had affected. Denzel knocked gently on the open door. Is this a good time? Elijah looked up, his face brightening instantly. Mr. Denzel, he exclaimed, scrambling off the bed and rushing over. You came back. I said I would, didn't I? Denzel replied, kneeling to accept the boy's enthusiastic hug. And I always keep my promises. Vanessa smiled warmly. We didn't expect to see you again, what with your filming schedule. Please come in. The room felt intimate and safe, a stark contrast to the tension-filled warehouse. As Denzel settled into a chair, he noticed subtle changes in all three family members. Despite the trauma they'd endured, there was a new resilience in their interactions, a closer attentiveness to one another. I brought something for each of you, Denzel said, reaching into the gift bag. For Margaret, a beautiful cashmere scarf. The hospital gets cold during those overnight stays, he explained. For Vanessa, a collection of poems about strength and renewal. My wife finds these comforting during difficult times, he said. Finally, for Elijah, he produced a small box. The boy opened it carefully to reveal a replica police badge nestled in velvet. This is from Captain Reynolds and the entire department, Denzel explained as Elijah's eyes widened. They wanted you to have an honorary badge for your bravery. Not many 5-year-olds would have known what to do in that situation. Elijah held the badge reverently. Is it real? It's a special one made just for heroes who aren't old enough to be police officers yet, Denzel explained. Captain Reynolds says maybe in about 20 years you can turn it in for a real one. The boy beamed with pride, carefully pinning the badge to his shirt with his mother's help. How are you all doing, really? Denzel asked once the gifts had been properly admired. Margaret sighed. Taking it one day at a time. The doctors say Vanessa can go home tomorrow. We're looking at some family counseling options to help Elijah process everything. And Michael? Denzel asked carefully, aware of the complexity of their feelings toward Torres. He's being evaluated at the psychiatric facility, Vanessa replied. His lawyer reached out. He wants to apologize, but I'm not ready for that. Yet? She paused, absently running her fingers through Elijah's hair. Maybe someday for Jason's sake, but not now. Elijah, who had been studying his badge, looked up suddenly. Is the man with the scar going to jail because he's a bad guy? The adults exchanged glances, unsure how to explain the nuances of Torres's situation to a child. Denzel leaned forward slightly. He did something very wrong by taking your mom away and scaring everyone, he explained carefully. But he's also someone who is sick in a way doctors can't see from the outside. So he's going somewhere where he can get help for that sickness, while also making sure he can't scare anyone else. Elijah considered this with surprising maturity. Like when Daddy's brain got sick after the war. Mom said sometimes brains get hurt too, not just bodies. Vanessa's eyes glistened with tears. That's right, honey, very much like that. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. Elijah's upcoming kindergarten year, the support they'd received from their community, and the family's plans to take a vacation once things settled down. Throughout their interaction, Denzel noticed how Elijah stayed physically connected to his mother, leaning against her side, holding her hand or sitting in her lap, as if reassuring himself she was truly there. As their visit neared its end, Officer Rodriguez arrived with news. Sorry to interrupt, she said after greeting everyone, but I thought you'd want to know right away. We've completed the investigation of Torres's apartment. We found journals that confirm he'd been planning this for months, but we also found something else, letters from Jason that Torres kept. They provide some important context. She handed Vanessa a sealed evidence bag containing photocopies of several handwritten letters. The originals need to remain in evidence, but the department wanted you to have copies. They're from Jason to Torres during the months before Jason's death. Vanessa accepted the package with trembling hands. Thank you, she whispered. Officer. Rodriguez turned to Denzel. The chief would like to speak with you before you leave Atlanta. There's talk of a formal commendation. Denzel shook his head slightly. Not necessary, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Because my son knew exactly who to approach, Margaret pointed out. Don't diminish what you did. Not many celebrities would have taken a child seriously, let alone put themselves at risk afterward. As Denzel prepared to leave, Elijah tugged at his hand. Can I show you something? The boy led him to the window where several of his drawings were displayed. He pointed to one that showed a McDonald's restaurant with tiny figures inside. This is where it started, he said seriously. When I saw you, I remembered all the movies, where you help people. Grandma and I watched them together when Mum was at work. You made a very smart choice, Denzel assured him. Are you going to make a movie about us now? Elijah asked innocently. Denzel smiled, crouching to the boy's level. No, Elijah. Some stories aren't meant for movies. Some are just for the people who lived them. The boy nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense to him. Before leaving, Denzel had a quiet moment with Vanessa, while Margaret took Elijah to the hospital cafeteria for ice cream. The media attention will fade, he assured her, recognizing her concern about the public nature of their ordeal. But if you ever need anything, resources for Elijah, contacts for counseling, anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out. He handed her a card with his personal assistant's contact information. Thank you, Vanessa said, meeting his gaze directly. Not just for the rescue, but for seeing Michael as a person, not just a monster. That's what Jason would have wanted, as I. Denzel left the hospital, navigating past a few persistent photographers. He reflected on the strange sequence of events that had pulled him from his carefully controlled film set into the messy, unpredictable reality of actual heroism. In his decades-long career, he had portrayed dozens of heroes, men who made difficult choices in impossible situations. But none of those roles had prepared him for the raw emotional impact of a 5-year-old boy's trust or the weight of a real life hanging in the balance. 1 month later, the Atlanta Children's Hospital auditorium buzzed with anticipation. What had begun as a small ceremony to honor Elijah's bravery had evolved into something much larger, a community celebration and fundraising event for children affected by trauma. Local news cameras lined the back wall, and every seat was filled. Denzel Washington sat in the front row alongside Captain Reynolds and officers Rodriguez and Davis. He had flown back to Atlanta specifically for this event, having completed his filming obligations 2 weeks earlier. The film's director had even incorporated a subtle nod to Denzel's real-life heroism into the script, a line about ordinary people finding courage in extraordinary moments. On stage, the mayor of Atlanta concluded her opening remarks, which is why today we not only celebrate the exceptional bravery of one child, but also launch a new initiative to support families dealing with the invisible wounds of trauma and mental health challenges. The audience applauded as Margaret and Vanessa escorted Elijah to the stage. The boy wore a crisp button-down shirt and his honorary police badge, polished to a shine. Though still shy, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "Elijah Mitchell," the mayor announced, "on behalf of the city of Atlanta, we present you with this Civilian Bravery Award for your extraordinary courage and quick thinking that saved your mother's life." The 5-year-old accepted the framed certificate with solemn dignity, his eyes searching the crowd until they found Denzel. When their gazes met, Elijah broke into a wide smile that illuminated the entire room. Following the presentation, Vanessa stepped to the microphone. In the month since her ordeal, she had emerged as an unexpected advocate for both children's trauma support and veterans' mental health services. "My late husband, Jason, returned from war physically intact, but carrying invisible wounds," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Like many veterans, he struggled to find appropriate support, and like many families, we didn't always know how to help him." She paused, gathering herself. "The events that led to my kidnapping were tragic and frightening, but they've also created an opportunity to address these gaps in our system. Today I'm honored to announce the Jason Mitchell Foundation for Military Families, which will provide resources for veterans and their children dealing with the long-term impacts of service-related trauma." The crowd rose in a standing ovation as Vanessa unveiled the foundation's logo, a simple design featuring a teddy bear wearing a military cap. Seeing it, Elijah beamed with pride. His beloved teddy, now a symbol of both his bravery and his father's legacy. When Denzel was invited to the stage, the applause intensified. He embraced Elijah warmly before addressing the audience. "I've played many heroes throughout my career," he began, "but I've learned that real heroism rarely looks like what we see in movies. Real heroes are often small, with teddy bears and gap-toothed smiles." He gestured toward Elijah, who giggled at the reference. "Or they're people like Vanessa, who despite experiencing trauma, choose compassion and understanding over bitterness." Denzel continued, his resonant voice filling the auditorium. "Today, I'm proud to announce my own commitment to the Jason Mitchell Foundation. My production company will fund a specialized program for children of veterans, creating safe spaces where kids like Elijah can process their experiences through art, storytelling, and play." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. What had begun as a chance encounter in a McDonald's had transformed into a movement with the potential to help countless families. After the ceremony, a reception allowed for more personal interactions. Denzel chatted with Captain Reynolds about the case's resolution. "Torres accepted a plea deal last week," Reynolds explained. "He'll receive intensive psychiatric treatment as part of his sentence. The letters from Jason made a difference. They showed Torres had been struggling with his mental health since Afghanistan, with Jason being his main support system. When Jason died, Torres lost his anchor to reality." "Has Vanessa spoken with him?" Denzel asked. Reynolds nodded. "Briefly, under controlled conditions. She showed him Elijah's drawing of his father. Apparently, it was a significant moment for both of them. Across the room, Elijah demonstrated his honorary badge to a group of admiring children. The boy who had once been too frightened to speak above a whisper now animated his story with expressive gestures, his trauma transformed into a narrative of courage and triumph. Margaret approached Denzel with a small package. "Elijah made this. For you," she said. "He's been working on it for weeks." Inside was a handmade picture frame decorated with colorful buttons and beads. The photo inside showed Denzel kneeling beside Elijah at the hospital, both smiling at the camera as the boy proudly displayed his badge. "He keeps your photo by his bed," Margaret explained. "He tells everyone you're his friend, not just someone from the movies." Before Denzel could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A group of children from the pediatric ward had arrived, young patients dealing with their own battles, many in wheelchairs or wearing medical masks. They had been invited as special guests, and their excitement at meeting Elijah, whose story had become legend in the hospital, was palpable. Vanessa joined Denzel and Margaret, watching as Elijah solemnly shook hands with each child, showing them his badge and listening intently to their stories. "He's different now," Vanessa observed quietly. "Stronger, more confident. The therapist says helping others is part of his healing process." "And you?" Denzel asked. "How are you healing?" Vanessa considered the question thoughtfully. "I've read Jason's letters to Michael a dozen times. They reveal so much about my husband that I never fully understood. His loyalty, his compassion for a troubled friend, his struggle to appear strong for us when he was fighting his own battles." She watched her son interacting with the children. "In an odd way, this ordeal has given Elijah and me a deeper connection to Jason. His legacy is more alive now than it has been since his death." As the event concluded, Denzel prepared for his return flight to Los Angeles. Film commitments and press obligations awaited, but something had shifted in his perspective. The characters he portrayed, men of principle facing impossible odds, no longer felt like mere fictional constructs. Elijah had seen something real in those performances, something authentic enough to trust with his mother's life. Before leaving, Denzel knelt to say goodbye to Elijah. "Will you come back and visit?" the boy asked, his expression serious. "I promise," Denzel replied, matching his solemnity, "and when the foundation opens its first children's center next year, I'll be there for the ribbon cutting." Satisfied with this commitment, Elijah handed Denzel a folded piece of paper, one final drawing. It showed a McDonald's restaurant with a small boy and a tall man holding hands. "This is where we became friends," Elijah explained simply. As Denzel's car pulled away from the hospital, he unfolded the drawing again, noting the careful detail Elijah had included. The bright red and yellow of the McDonald's sign, the teddy, bear clutched in the boy's hand, and the unmistakable look of determination on both their faces as they prepared to save the day. In his decades-long career, Denzel had accumulated numerous awards celebrating his artistic achievements. Yet somehow this crayon drawing from a 5-year-old boy who had believed in the hero behind the roles felt more significant than all of them. A chance encounter in a fast food restaurant had changed multiple lives forever, reminding everyone involved that real heroism wasn't about dramatic actions or perfect solutions. Sometimes it was simply about listening when a small voice whispered for help. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales of courage and connection. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and share your thoughts on this incredible journey of bravery and healing.